This is my screencast on how the U-2 incident escalated the Cold War. One reason that the U-2 incident escalated the Cold War was that it weakened the relationship between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Not long before the incident, Khrushchev visited the U.S., where he really got along with Eisenhower and the American people, and he even considered Eisenhower a friend. This quote shows how he really liked the U.S. and his people, so a lot of people thought that the two leaders could work together to really bring the Cold War to an end. But when Khrushchev found out about the U-2 incident, his whole attitude towards Eisenhower changed. This quote shows that he not only took it as an insult towards his country, but he also felt this personal betrayal because when he was in America, he thought Eisenhower was a friend, and he even directly dismisses this friendship in this quote by saying, "I don't need such a friend," referring to Eisenhower. This feeling of betrayal that Khrushchev felt was very strong, as he really didn't think Eisenhower himself was behind the U-2 flight and program, because Eisenhower was, after all, in his mind, a friend, and he didn't think he would do such a thing due to the upcoming summit meeting. He assumed that the CIA or the military was doing it behind the president's back. So when Eisenhower announced that he was behind the U-2 programs and personally approved it, Khrushchev was very angry, and according to his son Sergei Khrushchev, he flew into a rage and was very infuriated. He was also willing to use force and violence to respond to this incident, as he mentions that in order to teach smart Alex a lesson, referring to the Americans, they need to use a fist, which means violence and force. So this whole aspect of betrayal and mistrust from the U-2 incident contributed to the Cold War because it destroyed the relationship between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Especially after Khrushchev's visit to the U.S., a lot of the world thought that tensions were going to be released between the two countries, and that the end of the Cold War was just beginning. But with the U-2 incident, tensions became even higher, and the two leaders were no longer friends, which immediately got rid of the possibility that they would unite to end the war. Also, because Khrushchev was so angry that Eisenhower had messed with the Soviet Union, he wanted to teach the U.S. a lesson, and he was willing to use force and violence to do so, even though previously he was seeking a détente with the U.S. The U-2 incident also weakened the credibility and authority of the two leaders, so both Khrushchev and Eisenhower were harmed by this incident. Eisenhower was obviously experienced a lot of embarrassment, as not only was it scandalous that the U.S. was practicing espionage in the Soviet Union, but he was also caught in a lie to cover it up as a weather project. And this looked really bad because he also lost a lot of respect from his own country. And the whole scheme to get Eisenhower caught in a lie was set up by Khrushchev, who deliberately omitted the fact that the U-2 pilot was still alive just to see what the U.S. government would come up with. But ironically, he too was harmed by this incident because Khrushchev had assumed that all of this was done behind the president's back. It was the CIA or the military. And because of this assumption, Khrushchev continued to praise Eisenhower as a friend, a view that most people in the Soviet Union disagreed with. Khrushchev was also seeking a détente with the U.S. But once Eisenhower admitted that he himself was behind the whole program, this made Khrushchev lose a lot of credibility because it showed that everything he thought and said about Eisenhower was wrong, and that Eisenhower was not the friend that he thought he was. This contributed to the escalation of the Cold War because Eisenhower and Khrushchev were seen as the two most powerful leaders at the time, and because of this, the world kind of depended on them to make the right decisions and end the war. They were seen as the leaders, almost like the parents who were going to take care of everything. But once the U-2 incident happened, both Eisenhower and Khrushchev lost their authority and credibility amongst the rest of the world, which left the world without any leading figures to initiate the end of the Cold War. Another reason the U-2 incident escalated the Cold War was because the Soviets used it to stop other countries, mostly American allies, from having military bases on their land. They used it in their propaganda. The U-2 incident was kind of used as an example of the dark side of Americans to convince these countries to stop having relations with the U.S. And they even got quite violent with their campaigns, and they threatened the governments of other countries to intimidate them into following their demands. And in order to prevent losing their allies, the U.S. Promised to defend any country that was attacked by the Soviet Union for having American military bases on its land. But even so, these countries were still very wary of the U.S., and some of our ally countries, such as Taiwan and Japan, had outbursts of anti-Americanism in parts of these countries, which is one reason why in the Paris summit meeting, Eisenhower had his meeting from his invitation from Japan rescinded because they couldn't ensure his safety because there were bouts of anti-Americanism in there. This contributed to the escalation of the Cold War because the use of anti-Americanism in Russian propaganda turned many countries against the U.S., including some allies, which in turn took away some of the power and influence the country had around the world. This ties back to the idea that the Cold War was really characterized by the amount of tension between all the countries. And by using anti-Americanism in Russian propaganda, the tensions between the U.S. and many other countries, including some of our allies' countries, began to rise even more, which escalated the Cold War. But perhaps the biggest reason the U-2 incident escalated the Cold War was because it caused the 1960 Paris summit to fall apart. The Paris summit was supposed to discuss many issues that played a big part in the Cold War, and they were possibly going to try to solve these issues. And around the world, it was seen as this event that could have helped end the Cold War. But because of the U-2 incident, Khrushchev was still very angry and had a list of demands that Eisenhower had to give into in order for the meeting to continue. And these demands included apologizing for the U-2 incident, promising to never cross Soviet borders again, and punishing those involved in the incident. But Eisenhower didn't give into this list of demands and did not accept Khrushchev's ultimatum, so the summit ended before any discussion took place. This contributed to the Cold War because the Paris meeting was really supposed to solve a bunch of these issues that played a big part in the continuation of the Cold War. But the U-2 incident caused the falling out that ended the summit before any of these problems could have been solved. There was no discussion of the situation in Berlin, which led to the Berlin Wall. There were no talks on disarmament, which could have done a lot to end the Cold War, as the fear of being attacked played a large part in the war. It was what drove Eisenhower to approve the U-2 flights in the first place. So the U-2 incident escalated the Cold War because it prevented the Paris summit meeting from taking place and therefore prevented many problems from being solved.